If you're still using VST 2.4 plugins in 2024, please stop. No, seriously, you want to stop. Let me explain why, in my opinion, in 2024, you should only be using plugins that support VST 3. Hey everyone, Dom here. Today, I'm gonna talk about a topic that seems to be coming up all the time. I get many questions about it. There's a lot of misunderstanding that surrounds it, and I want to give you guys a little bit of my perspective, and this is all about VST 2 versus VST 3 plugins. I've seen many times comments about why I can't upgrade to the latest version of my DAW because now VST 2 plugins are not supported and I'm using this really old plugin and I want to be able to load it. Shame on the DAW companies, they should support VST 2.4 and so on and so forth. And I have my thoughts about this. But in order to be able to answer this question, we need to go back and learn what is the VST protocol to begin with. And I think many people don't really know, especially younger people don't know where this came from. The VST protocol, which stands for Virtual Studio Technology, was created by Steinberg actually in 1996. So let's take a moment here and realize that Steinberg, many of you might be using Cubase amongst my viewers, were the pioneers of all this technology that we have today and we're blessed to be using, like VST effects, reverbs, delays, compressors, EQs, instruments, synths. Before the VST protocol, none of this existed. So if you wanted a compressor, you had to go to a hardware compressor. If you wanted an EQ, you needed to buy a hardware EQ or a digital EQ in the form of a console or something like this. But the concept of having a virtual EQ or a virtual compressor or a virtual synthesizer inside your computer was unheard of. And I have to say, most young people might not even know about this. They might not even know that Steinberg was the company responsible for all these beautiful things that we have in our computers these days. Since 1996, the VST protocol has been adopted widely and it's supported by most popular DAWs right now. So Cubase, Studio One, Ableton, FL Studio, they all use VST plugins. So pretty much if you're using a DAW that uses the VST protocol, you're essentially using Steinberg technology. Now that we know a little bit about VST, let's talk about the VST 2 versus VST 3. Now VST 2 has been around for a long time and some of the most popular plugins were written on this VST 2.4 protocol. But then in 2008, and hold that year, right? Steinberg introduced the VST 3 protocol that allowed many improvements. There was better performance, better efficiency. The plugins could be categorized so you could have dynamics and then you would have all your compressors right there regardless of the developer and the company that makes the plugin. They had dynamic inputs and outputs, which means the inputs and outputs of a plugin or an instrument could be adapted depending on how many inputs and outputs you as the user wants to use. Sample accurate automation was also introduced, so the plugins were way more accurate when you were doing automation. And the number one thing that I was interested in was that the VST 3 protocol allowed for sidechain. And not only that, now the VST 3 protocol allows for multiple sidechain inputs, not sources, inputs. I've explained this in this video. Not many people get it. It's very, very different to multiple sources. So what's all this fuss about people wanting to stick with VST 2.4? If you ask me, I ditched VST 2 plugins years ago. I would say around 6 to 7 years ago, I stopped using VST 2 plugins. If a developer didn't have a VST 3 version, I was plainly not installing their plugin because I wanted to make sure that the plugin that I was using in my project was optimized, it wouldn't crash, and many VST 2.4 plugins had really lousy programming. And of course, sidechain was very important to me. There's no reason for me to have a compressor if I cannot do sidechain with it. And having a compressor just for the sake of having it wasn't enough of a reason. So I was always using plugins that had a VST3 version for years now. And I'm glad I did. And let me explain why you should only be using VST3 plugins in 2024 in my humble opinion. So some of the arguments that come up online are, I'm very upset because VST2 is not supported on the the latest versions of macOS and especially Apple Silicon computers, you have to use VST3. The second argument is I have some old plugins that I want to use and I have to stick with an old version of my DAW so that I can use these plugins. And the third argument is DAWs shouldn't ditch VST 2.4 because they should have compatibility. And let me explain here why none of these arguments make any sense to me. So let's take argument number one. VST3 is not supported on the latest Apple Silicon computers. So you have to understand, in order to develop a protocol like VST3, there's a big number of people developing this format. They are testing it, they are writing code for it, and they also have to maintain it and improve it. This requires time, it requires money, it requires resources. If you're living in a fairy tale and you think this is all done just by magic, then think again. So when Apple came with the new Silicon computers, many things wouldn't work. And Steinberg was one of the few developers that adapted to these new Apple Silicon computers very quickly, and also the performance of Cubase is one of the best performances you can get in any DAW with the new Apple Silicon computers. But if Steinberg wanted to retain compatibility with the VST 2.4 in these new Apple Silicon computers, guess what they would have to do? They would have to rewrite an old protocol, VST 2.4, that was actually retired in 2008, write it again, waste resources from other things that are more important just to be able to bring an old protocol to the new operating systems and the new CPUs. Does that make any sense to you? And if it still does, let me talk a little bit about the second argument. I have some old plugins that I really love and I want to use them in the latest operating systems. And for this, I have multiple answers. You have to think, all these developers that are still on VST 2.4, they had plenty of time to upgrade their plugins in VST 3. Again, VST 3 was released in 2008. We're talking 16 years from today. I think this is plenty of time, and in my opinion, and this is not a sponsored video, I'm doing this because I get all of these questions all the time. Steinberg didn't discontinue VST 2.4. It actually exists to this day. They could have said, you know what, we're done with the VST 2.4, we're not maintaining this, we're not spending any more resources, so update your plugins to VST3. That would be the Apple way to do things. Apple, when they released the new silicons, they didn't ask anyone, oh, okay, I need 3-4 years to adapt my software to the new processors. No, not at all. They went bulldozer, they just left everything behind and they went for progress. But Steinberg gave all these developers 16 years to come up with a VST3 version. So in my opinion, I understand that this is a lot of work, rewriting the code and everything, but for you as a user, if your favorite plugin has not been ported to VST3, what makes you think it's gonna happen anytime soon? And second, if with all these beautiful plugins that we have today, you still cannot find an equivalent or an even better version of that beloved plugin you used to use, I understand it's nostalgia and all these things, but the newer plugins are, for most of the part, much better. You just have to do your research and find a really good plugin that's actually modern, and it is VST3, or it is AU if you're using Logic. And some people say, well, I want to be able to open my old projects. In this case, I'm going to direct you to this video where I show you how to foolproof your projects even years, decades after you finish them, no matter whether the plugins that you use are still alive or completely dead. And don't get me wrong, I still have my old favorite plugins that I cannot do without when the TC Electronic plugins, for example, the MD3 and the MD4, were not compatible with Apple Silicon. I literally had to keep waiting until they were compatible because they're a big part of my sound. But eventually, if they were not going to update them, I would just have to find an alternative. I would have to find a different way to do the job with modern tools. So if you want my advice, it's the advice that I would give to my friends, to my producer friends, whenever we talk about these things. That's what I always say. Don't wait for old technology to catch up. Don't wait for old plugins to catch up. If they're going to catch up, great. If they're not going to, then move on. find something else. You can always do the job no matter whether this old plugin is still alive or not. The most important thing is your skills and how you use the tools that are available at any given time. So here's my 2 cents. In my opinion, in 2024, use plugins that are fully updated, they're maintained, the developers really care about them and they support them, and save yourself some frustration and grief by trying to adapt your workflow to old plugins. In my opinion, it's way more important that you're up to date with your DAW, because this is what's going to make the huge difference for the speed that you can produce, mix and master, rather than a plugin that has been dormant for 15 or 20 years or so. In the comments down below, let me know, do you agree with what I said? Do you just move on and you use technology that's currently supported? Or do you prefer to stay old school, keep your old plugins, your legacy plugins, and maybe use an older DAW version or even an older computer to be able to run them? And if you want to see the plugins that I use, you can always check out my courses. I'm going to link them down below. I've done 3 mastering courses, one for mastering in Cubase, one for mastering in the box, where I show you all the latest and greatest plugins that I use right now, and also the analog hybrid mastering masterclass, where I do mastering with analog gear. You can also check out my Modern 80s Kit Max, or you can use the join button, the super thanks button, or just a plain old like button. And while you're here, you might also want to check this video out or this video out. Thank you so much, my friends, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.